Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1090 for January 5th, 2025. Hope your new year was festive and fun. Coming up in a few minutes.
So today, I wanted to ask you a few questions and interview you instead of you interviewing me or someone else. So we're going to ask a few questions and hopefully we'll be able to share some thoughts with the listeners and get them to know you better, especially those that have joined recently to listen to the podcast. What about that?
2025 marks the 20th anniversary of WhiskyCast as the longest-running podcast series devoted to whiskey, and I agreed to sit down for an interview with longtime listener Juan Cruz this week. Juan collected questions from WhiskyCast Community app users for our conversation, which is coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
The second release in Dewar's four-part collector series, Dewar's Double Double 38-Year-Old, is now available. It's a tribute to the Scottish Highlands, and it's like nothing you've had before. More in a minute.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy once updated health warning labels on alcoholic beverages. Dr. Murthy released a Surgeon General's advisory statement this week, stating that alcohol use has been linked to increased cases of 7 different types of cancer. The statement says alcohol consumption is the third leading preventable cause of cancer in the U.S. after tobacco and obesity. Congress would have to approve legislation requiring tougher warning labels, and a spokesperson for the Distilled Spirits Council cited a recent National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report showing that moderate alcohol consumption is associated with a higher risk of breast cancer, but did not find links to other cancers. She says the current health warning is based on the entire body of scientific research. MGP Ingredients CEO David Bratcher has resigned. The move follows a class action lawsuit filed by a labor union's pension fund last month, accusing the contract distiller of misleading investors about the company's finances. The company did not give a reason for Bratcher's resignation. He joined the company in 2021 when it acquired Luxco. MGP reaffirmed its fiscal 2024 sales and adjusted earnings outlook when it announced Bratcher's departure. New MGP chairman Don Lux will lead the search for a new CEO. Chief Financial Officer Brandon Gowell will serve as interim president and CEO during the search. The UK government has released the annual King's New Year's Honours list, and there's one whiskey-related name on the list. Glenmorangie's Dr. Bill Lumsden was named a member of the Order of the British Empire, or MBE. Congratulations. Glencairn Crystal is suing a California-based retailer for trademark infringement. The company is accusing Wine & Gear of falsely advertising its products as official Glencairn products. Glencairn has asked a federal judge to issue a permanent injunction banning Wine & Gear from making and selling the infringing products. Australia's Sullivan's Cove distillery has reopened to guests after a $14 million overhaul. The work includes a new tasting room and remodeled cellar door shop, along with expansion of the distillery itself to include 2 new stills and updated fermenting and grain handling equipment. And finally, police in Scotland are looking for information about a whiskey theft last month at the House of Brewers shop in Perthshire. The thieves took off with what's being called a considerable number of high-value bottles, including a 54-year-old Highland Park bottle valued at £39,000. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast Community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's start off the new year with a look at some upcoming whiskey events around the world. The Southeast Texas Whiskey Festival is this coming Saturday in Beaumont, Texas, along with the Arctic Whiskey Festival in Tromsø, Norway, and the Harrow Whiskey Festival in London. Canadian Whiskey Week is the 13th through the 19th, and the Edmonton MS Whiskey Festival is on the 15th. It's followed the next night by the Calgary MS Whiskey Festival and the Canadian Whiskey Awards ceremony in Victoria, British Columbia. That kicks off the annual Victoria Whiskey Festival, which runs through the 19th. I'll have special coverage from Victoria once again this year. The Brandy Library in New York City has a spirit school tasting, pitting whiskeys from Scotland against Japan on the 18th. The Kensington Wine Market in Calgary has its annual Burns Bash Whiskey Festival on the 21st, and the Whiskey Global is January 24th and 25th in Vancouver, British Columbia. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast Community app.
Dewar's Double Double 38-year-old is the second release in a 4-part limited edition collector series honoring Scotland's most legendary whiskey regions. This rare blended malt, a tribute to the Upper Scottish Highlands, is crafted from nearly 4-decade-old Highland and Islay whiskies. It undergoes Dewar's unique 4-stage aging process with a final finish in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks from the prestigious Royal Brackla single malt. The finish invites you to explore your own tasting notes, but for me, there's incredible depth, with rich layers of vanilla, toasted cereals, dried figs, plums, dark chocolate, and a subtle hint of Islay smoke, all beautifully balanced. To truly elevate this tasting experience, renowned chef Gabriel Cruther, in collaboration with Dewar's, has created an exclusive selection of custom chocolates. Crafted from the world's finest ingredients, each piece is infused with a few precious drops of Dewar's Double Double 38-year-old whiskey, making this a luxurious and unforgettable pairing. Now available, this exquisite pairing of whiskey and chocolate promises to deliver an unforgettable experience. Please drink responsibly. Copyright 2024. Dewar's is a trademark. Imported by John Dewar & Sons Company, Coral Gables, Florida. Blended Scotch whiskey, 48.8% alcohol by volume.
This week on WhiskyCast In-Depth, we're turning the tables on yours truly. It's the 20th year of WhiskyCast, and I agreed to let longtime listener Juan Cruz ask the questions this week. He collected the questions from members of the WhiskyCast community, and I've only done a bit of light editing to take out a few pauses in the conversation.
Happy New Year, Mark. How you doing?
Happy New Year, Juan. Thank you for visiting us and for doing this.
So today, I wanted to ask you a few questions and interview you instead of you interviewing me or someone else. So we're going to ask a few questions and hopefully we'll be able to share some thoughts with the listeners and get them to know you better, especially those that have joined recently to listen to the podcast. What about that?
I'm a little nervous, but go ahead.
All right. So for the benefit of listeners, especially those that may not have heard the story before, could you tell us about the origin story of WhiskyCast?
Well, it was in 2005, and podcasting was just starting off at that point. And the company I was working for at the time, producing all of our broadcast content for CNN and other folks, wanted to get into podcasting. And I was the person who was going to have to make it work, so I said, wait a second, let me go play with this for a little bit and see what we're getting ourselves into. So I had thought about doing a whiskey podcast anyway and decided that I should take my audio gear to Whiskey Fest New York in November of 2005 and do some interviews, come back, produce a few episodes of what we were going to call WhiskyCast, and use that as the test bed for the corporate podcast we were going to put together. And lo and behold, WhiskyCast stuck, and I kept doing it over and over again, sometimes 2 and 3 times a week back in those early days. And I went back and told the bosses, we can do this. at the corporate level. Here's what it's going to take. Here's what the IT guys are going to have to do. And so we started producing the corporate podcast, and a few months later, they closed my studio in Princeton, laid me off, and moved operations to Washington, D.C., and hired a kid at a third of my salary to produce the podcast.
All right.
But WhiskyCast kept going, and it's going to this day.
20 years later, we're still here, still producing the podcast.
Still producing the podcast and still having fun.
Is there a particular reason why you chose whiskey instead of some other topic?
I learned by talking to people and talking to experts in the field. And at that point, I was just exploring whiskey for the first time. I'd been drinking it for a few years, but I was really starting to explore it as an enthusiast. And I figured, what better way to learn about whiskey than by talking to the experts who make it? And
I think that's an excellent reason to go into that. And have you enjoyed it?
Oh yeah, I'm having fun. I've been doing this longer than I've done any job in my entire 45 years of broadcasting.
Excellent. So starting a whiskey podcast, like you mentioned, or any podcast for that matter, in 2005 when podcasting was in its infancy, must have felt perhaps as a daunting task. What challenges since the birth of WhiskyCast makes you reflect back on and get a significant sense of achievement after 20 years?
Well, lasting 20 years is a big achievement. There are very few podcasts that have been around as long as we have, and nothing in the whiskey space. There were no other whiskey podcasts when I started WhiskyCast, but to be over 1,000 episodes, to have been doing this for over 19 years now, we're in our 20th year. Those are accomplishments that I can take a lot of pride in.
And, when some of the listeners, and I've done it, we go back and we start from episode 1. I mean, it's 1,000, over 1,000 episodes, but it's quite a learning experience. And we thank you for this many years of podcasting. It's been a very nice learning experience.
Well, thank you for listening for all these years.
I had to do the project because I didn't find the podcast until about 2019, right before the pandemic. So I embarked on let's listen from episode 1 while still listening to the weekly episode as they come out, and learned a lot. And it's been fantastic.
Thank you.
So, you're going on your 20th year of independent whiskey journalism. You have reported on a myriad of diverse news about whiskey, the industry, and its people. Is there a news that you report first before anyone else on WhiskyCast?
Yeah, most of the news we report before anybody else. Sometimes other people beat us to it.
All right.
But most of the time we're either the first or second to be on a story.
And of course you observe the embargo rules, so if someone goes and lets it out before the embargo is done, then
it's fair game.
Then it's fair game.
Yeah, and I should explain what an embargo is. Oftentimes I'll be given advance news of a new whiskey under embargo until a certain date and time, which lets me prepare for it, request interviews, and be ready when the word of the whiskey is officially able to be reported on. But if somebody else gets that news first and breaks it on Twitter or a reputable whiskey news source, then it's fair game, and then I feel that I can report on it at that point. It doesn't happen very often.
Thank you for explaining that, because not a lot of people know that this is something that happens, that you're asked to keep something on the wraps, but when someone else gets it out, it's fair game and anyone can report on it.
Yeah, for instance, the news this week about Bill Lumsden getting an MBE, I got an early tip on it from somebody who had access to the list and knew that Bill had been named, but I couldn't report it till the list came out. But nobody else did, so I waited until the list was published and then reported it.
And, we want to congratulate Bill on that. It's a great honor. And if he's listening, Bill, congratulations on your New Year's honors.
Yes.
Of the news that you have reported, is there one that stands out as a favorite or a most memorable that you always remember?
Good question. To be honest, they all sort of blend together after a while.
I'm sure.
And it's really hard to find one that stands out.
Okay. What about something that stands out as the hardest news that you ever had to report? Did that maybe made an impression on you?
The hardest news to report is when someone has passed away.
Yeah. That
has been in the industry a long time. Parker Beam was especially hard when he passed away from ALS.
Yeah.
This month, I think about 7 years ago, is when we lost Parker, and that was a tough story to report. But when we lose somebody who's been around the industry for so long, that's always hard.
And, as we listen to the show over the last, almost 20 years, there have been quite a few of those. I mean, I can remember Parker and when Dave Pickerel passed away.
Right.
That was a tough one too.
That was a tough one because it was so sudden and unexpected.
It was even tough. I can tell you that it was even tough to listen. I mean, just listening is like, what?
Yeah, because Parker, we knew with ALS, we knew the time was coming. But with Dave, it was completely sudden.
Yeah.
And a shock to everybody who knew him.
Yes, it was. So, listeners have been following recent news from the whiskey world, like the prices where they are, the expected tariffs coming soon, the premiumization of the market, and even the hyper offer. I call it the hyper offer of expressions coming out all the time, and even closures and bankruptcies that we've had recently. Some of the distilleries and businesses. Seems that difficult times may lie ahead for producers and whiskey lovers alike. So based on your experience, and here's the question, and the knowledge of the industry, and maybe your tea leaf reading skills, if you do that, how do you read what's happening in the whiskey world today?
I think we are at an inflection point where it's not looking good. We've got a lot of supply, and sales are down. And a lot of whiskey that's going to be coming online in the next 5 to 7 years from distilleries, especially in Kentucky, that I think we are in the middle of another whiskey lock.
Yeah.
And that it's not going to be a pretty sight. I think we're going to see more distilleries closing. I think we're going to see a lot of craft distillers either sell out or go out of business altogether because of a lack of distribution or a lack of sales, or both.
Do you think that if we have another whiskey lock, and for those that don't know, should take a moment and say, there was the whiskey lock. It was a period of so much stock and low sales that
we had this in the 1980s.
We had it in the 80s, and a lot of.
That's when we lost distilleries like Port Ellen and Brora, and a lot of distilleries closed in 1983 and 1984 because there was too much overproduction.
And that some of them some people are trying to bring them back now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that this time could be as bad as in the 80s? Worse? Not as bad?
I think we've got more global markets to expand to.
Yeah.
I think China will take up some of the slack. I think India will take up some of the slack. South America is a foothold that is just starting to be explored by Scotch whiskey.
Yeah.
And I think bourbon will gradually expand to those markets as well. I think that'll mitigate some of this.
but it will have, the impacts will be felt across the industry.
Oh, the impact is going to be felt worldwide.
Yeah. All right. So, while doing WhiskyCast, you have the unique, I would say, privilege of interviewing many important and significant personalities of the whiskey world. We can list, master distillers, blenders, distillery managers, CEOs, authors, writers, etc. That could be considered whiskey royalty today. Maybe not 20 years ago, but now they are. And I gotta tell you, these individuals are well known to listeners and perhaps the world today, in part thanks to your podcast. And I'll say that, and because without your news and your podcast, we may have never heard about them and learn what they do and the things that they contribute to the industry. I'm just being very frank with you there.
Thank you.
So, just to give you an example from some listening that I did to prepare for today, in the first 2 episodes, you interviewed the late Parker Beam, the late Dr. Jim Swan,
right,
on the same episode, and Jim McEwen, and I think it was on the second episode.
Right.
So that's just an example for listeners of the people that you have interviewed throughout the years, and you have interviewed many of them multiple times, and many others. So let's go back to that day at Whiskey Life New York in 2005. What was going through your mind as you conducted your very first interviews at the Whiskey Life New York in 2005 to get the WhiskyCast project going?
Well, my background is in radio and TV news, so it wasn't my first time doing interviews.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask a few quick questions of both Parker and Jim and everybody else we talked to that night, and hopefully not look too stupid in my questions. For instance, I asked Parker, we were talking about the release of the original Bernheim wheat whiskey at that point.
Yeah.
And I asked him what the mash bill was. And he looked at me like I had 2 heads because he doesn't give out his mash bills.
Oh, okay.
So I felt kind of dumb at that point. But we persevered and got a good interview out of it.
Is that asking for a family member for the secret recipe contents? And do you had any concerns after that event, or
no?
Were you worried that something wouldn't jive?
No, I was perfectly happy with the interviews. I was just wondering if anybody was going to listen to the podcasts.
Well, it was the early days, and at least I'm very glad that it stuck that it stuck with people, because I remember those days, and podcasts there were not that many, and you could mainly get news in short podcast format. It was just a few minutes. So going in at a full length show talking about whiskey, it was groundbreaking in a way, at least in my opinion, if you ask me. And I know there's some others that are very glad that we still have you around. How do you prepare for your interviews? Is there and this is a multi-part question, has there been an interview or interviewee that turned out to be the hardest to prepare for? So how do you prepare, and has there been anyone that was really hard to prepare to?
Normally I'll prepare by reading ahead about the distillery, finding out what I can about the person I'm interviewing.
Yep.
If it's an author, I try to read their book.
Yep.
The book that we're talking about. No, I've been lucky that most of the time it's been fairly easy to do the interviews, and I haven't had to work very hard to pull information out of people.
All right. Is there an interview that's been the most memorable or impactful interview or interviewee that you have done for a show?
I like to think each one has an impact of its own. I treat them all like my kids. I don't really have a favorite.
Oh, I understand.
once you've done 1,000 of these, they tend to all sort of, as I said earlier, they tend to blend together.
Okay.
But Jim McEwen was always one of my favorite interviews to do.
Yeah.
Because he was very outspoken, could talk a mile a minute, and didn't have any hesitancy about sharing his opinions.
And I fully agree with that. I mean, every time I listen to him, it's a joy it's a pleasure to listen to an interview with Jim.
Yeah. Dave Pickerel was much the same way.
I still remember the one that you did during the pandemic with Jim via the webcast, and then he was at home, and then you converted it into a podcast episode so that we could listen to it and as well instead of having to watch it. And that was a very nice interview. I really loved that interview.
Thank you.
Is there anyone in the whiskey industry whom you haven't interviewed but you would love to interview?
Yes. Bob Dalgarno, the whiskey maker at the Glenturret, who was whiskey maker at the Macallan for years. Bob hates doing interviews, hates doing media, and will not do them unless he's absolutely forced to. And every time the Glenturret releases something new, I put the request in, is Bob ready to talk yet? And nope, Bob's not doing interviews. He's not available. I would love to sit down and talk with Bob Dalgarno.
So if I asked you about elusive interviews, that's it?
That's it.
That's it?
Generally, everybody else I've wanted to talk to, I've been able to get.
All right. So there's none that you've wanted to do and has never materialized?
Other than Bob.
Other than Bob? Okay. Now, is there anyone non-whiskey related that you've always wanted to interview or talk to that you haven't and that you would like to talk to?
Non-whiskey related. There are a lot of people. I would have loved to have sat down with the late Jimmy Carter, for instance, and talked to him about politics.
Yes.
There are scientists I'd love to sit down and talk with.
Okay.
Business executives that would be great interviews, but they don't have any connection to the whiskey world, so I'm not going to be doing interviews with them.
Well, that's not enough for a show, but someone to talk to. Jimmy. So you mentioned Jimmy Carter. That's someone that you would have loved to talk to.
I would have loved to have spoken with him.
Any hockey players you would have loved to talk to? So we said no, whiskey related. And again, it's not for the show. It would be, I would love to have a chat with this person.
Well, I've interviewed Wayne Gretzky before, and he's my favorite player of all time. I would have loved to have interviewed Gordie Howe before his passing.
All right.
Maurice Richard would have been a great player to talk to. Let's leave it at that.
Okay. Fair enough. During some of your in-depth features, it is common to discuss trends in whiskey, and we know that companies' marketing can influence or drive trends with their various claims, including the uniqueness of their products and whatnot. What, in your opinion, should not change in whiskey?
The camaraderie that we get when we drink whiskey with friends.
Yes.
I think that if we ever lose that, then we've lost the soul of whiskey.
I totally agree with that. Because we make the memories that we make with friends while sharing a dram are priceless.
For instance, we're sitting here drinking a 1985 Glenrothes, and I can't think of anybody I'd rather share it with right now.
Oh, thank you very much. What I was going to say, the next question is, well, I'll start by saying ethical reporting, fairness, and transparency and editorial independence are very important tenets of your work and WhiskyCast, which I really appreciate because those are great tenets to have and things to be driven by. Have there been any instances where you had to remind individuals or businesses of these tenets? And you don't have to mention any names. How did they take it?
There was one instance where a distillery was sued by one of these lawyers that likes to file class action lawsuits, and he sued the distillery over its claim that the whiskeys were handmade.
Okay.
When there were machines, obviously, that had been used in making them. But this brand was a sponsor of ours. Mm-hmm. And I had been calling all of the attorneys that filed these lawsuits every time they filed one, because there were a bunch filed back about 10 years ago. And the only lawyer who called me back was the one who was suing my sponsor.
All right.
And I held the interview for a week to give them a chance to respond. I let them know, hey, I've done this interview. We're going to run it no matter what, but I want to give you the chance to respond. And they said, we don't comment on pending litigation. And when their sponsorship was up for renewal a few months later, they decided not to renew.
Oh.
But I stand by what we did, and I would do it again.
All right. Since 2005, you have tasted thousands of whiskeys, and have rated and written tasting notes for over 3,800 of them. The last count. Aware of this fact, and since I've had the privilege of seeing in person the WhiskyCast Studio selection, how many whiskeys do you estimate you have tasted, not necessarily rated?
Counting competition judgings that I've done, I'd say probably over 5,000.
And ratings aside, is there one that to you is your favorite?
No, I haven't found it yet.
You haven't found it yet?
I'm still looking.
You're still looking. Because I know you have shared the top rated ones that you've done.
Right, I've got 9 that have scored 98 points.
All right.
But I don't think I'll ever taste a 100-point whiskey.
But is there any in particular that you like? I mean, rating aside, that would be a favorite?
The Mortlach 70-year-old stands out. That's one I scored 98 points. Highland Park 1968 was another one I scored 98 points. There were a couple of Kurosawas from Japan that also got 98 points that I'd love to get my hands on some more of.
And what about like go-to whiskeys, like on a daily basis that you really enjoy to have when you're at home?
I don't have a go-to because I've got so many that I need to taste to do tasting notes on for the show that I find myself drinking the whiskeys that I need to taste.
All right.
Rather than the ones I want to taste.
And, that's fair because, you do about, 5 every week that you
3 to 5.
3 to 5 in the show. All right. So, is there a particular workflow for tasting your whiskey selections and how you decide which one you actually mention in the show? And for full disclosure, I did help you taste some yesterday for this week, so I saw how the tasting goes a little bit. But can you explain for our listeners how do you do it and how do you make your decision?
Well, I've got probably 100 whiskeys on my tasting table at any one point that I need to taste, and I generally will go through and pull samples. If I'll try to pull a theme. Like all bourbons or all ryes, something like that, or all single malts, or if I'm interviewing somebody from a distillery and I've got one of their expressions on the tasting table, I try to pull that one specifically to do tasting notes on as well. But I'll generally select 5 to 7 whiskeys a week to taste, and I'll do tasting notes for 3 to 4 of them
on
the show. And the others go onto the website.
So you may post 10 on the website, but then you mention in the show maybe 3 to 5. But they all go to the website. Go on the website. So while it's probably that, I would say most likely every long-time listener of the show knows about the worst dram you ever tasted, which would be Fishkey. Is that still correct?
Yeah, that's tied for the worst dram.
What was the other one?
The infamous PBR whiskey that was matured for all of 5 seconds.
5 seconds in wood. Yeah. What would you say is your most memorable dram? And what I mean by most memorable would be either the location, the quality of the dram, the company, or all of the above.
Most memorable would be that Mortlach 70.
And you had that where?
I had that in the warehouses at Gordon and MacPhail in Elgin, Scotland, with Michael Urquhart. And he pulled it as a surprise for me at the end of an interview.
Yeah.
And just the circumstances around it still stick out to this day, 15 years later. And for listeners, this interview is available on WhiskyCast.com and it's in the archives.
In the archives. What was great? What was so great about it?
Just the rarity of the whiskey.
Yeah.
Michael's always been a good friend, and to have it pulled out as a surprise. Just one more. I've got something for you to taste, and didn't even present it with any pomp and circumstance. Just poured it out of a sample bottle straight in front of me and said, "Taste this." And I tasted it, and I went, "Is this the Mortlach 70?" He goes, "Yeah."
So he didn't tell you in advance.
He didn't. I don't think he told me in advance. I'm having trouble remembering that part of it right now.
It's all right. And he blew your mind?
Yeah.
I think it would have blown mine too, because that must have been a great dram. Do you remember the specifics of aside from the age? Do you remember the specifics of it? How it was matured?
It was matured in a sherry travel or transport puncheon.
All right.
A large sherry transport cask. And it was very fruity and vibrant.
Yeah.
Didn't taste 70 years old. There was no oakiness to it whatsoever.
All right.
And just full of fruit and flavor.
And we're so glad that there's actually some left, because after that's such a long time.
Yeah.
There was actually some left. All right. So since the genesis of WhiskyCast, you've been always very accessible to the whiskey community, to your listeners. You've always had the email address. If you want to ask something or tell me something, you can contact me at this address. And I'll say this very sincerely. I think you have yourself become an important figure of the whiskey community. I know you may not like to hear it, but I want to be very frank with you. I think you are.
Thank you.
If you could describe the community with 5 words, what 5 words would you choose to describe the community?
Friends, accessibility, lack of ego, which is 3 words I know, but I'm using it as 1.
It's a concept, so we'll take it as 1.
Yeah. There's no showing off in the community. Got there's no ego about having a rare bottle, because everybody in the community has generally 1 or 2 of those really rare bottles. And just mutual respect.
Yes. And I think we've heard a lot about how, especially when you talk about the lack of ego, there's almost no competition. I mean, if I have a piece of equipment that fails, the distillery down the street from me, especially if you're in Scotland, there's so many distilleries so close to each other.
Yeah,
they'll lend each other a hand.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's one thing that strikes me about the community.
I'm talking about the WhiskyCast community.
Oh, I thought you were talking the whiskey,
greater whiskey community.
The greater whiskey community.
Oh no! In that case, it would be helpfulness, pride, charity. Whiskey makers raise a lot of money for charities with special drams that would otherwise go to flippers or go into the hands of collectors that would never see and not do any good.
Yeah.
Words like that would describe the whiskey community. Generosity.
That's for sure. Yes. I completely agree with you. I'm sorry I wasn't that clear. I mean, which community? No. But we had them both right there both. In one question. Now, this one is kind of tied to that question a little bit different. So, what aspects of today's whiskey community, including the online community, do you feel could be improved?
Good question. I'd like to see less flipping of whiskeys online.
Agree.
Less people trying to sell whiskeys off and online. The whiskey as an investment vehicle, I'd like to see a lot less of. Whiskey was meant to be shared and enjoyed, not invested in, and just sit on a shelf collecting dust.
Completely agree.
Those are the things I'd like to see changed.
And those are things that we have been talking about for a long time and recently as well. So I totally agree with you. How has the introduction of the WhiskyCast Community app helped you with the weekly production of the podcast?
It helps me generate material for the show.
Yeah.
I find out what people are interested in, and that gives me ideas for topics.
Yep.
The community segment each week gives me plenty of material to work with for that, with what people are talking about. And it lets me know that there are people out there listening.
Yeah.
Because we get regular feedback on episodes that you might not otherwise get.
Kind of what's on people's minds,
right,
and what's worrying them. I know that we had myself included, we had quite a conversation about prices a few times, and things are difficult to find nowadays. Recently.
Prices have gotten way out of line.
WhiskyCast is a family-owned small business, which is truly a team effort. In addition to the great team, your wife Christina make, what would you attribute the success and longevity of the podcast to?
Just the support from the family overall.
Yeah.
They supported me in the early days when I'd been laid off from my regular radio and TV job in 2009. They supported me in making this my full-time job when there weren't any jobs to be had in the recession back then.
Yeah.
Nobody was hiring in media. We lost 100,000 media jobs during the recession of 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
And never once did the family criticize me or suggest that what I was doing was a waste of time. They did suggest that Mom take over the business side of things.
Okay.
Because, frankly, I stunk at it.
All right.
And that made it possible to make it a full-time job.
And
I learned by giving up some control that I was able to have more control over what I did do. And by giving up some control of the sales and marketing side of things, I had the freedom to put it into the show.
And that support is still going strong.
Yep.
I can tell you that. I mean, from someone that is not, deep into it, I see it, and it's a very nice thing to have. You're doing very well. You've been to a lot of whiskey distilleries across the globe. of the places you haven't gone, where would you like to go? And I think I know the answer to this question, but we'll see.
I would like to see the new Macallan distillery. I've not seen it yet.
All right.
I would like to see some of the small distilleries like Edredauer.
Okay.
Distilleries that don't get a lot of attention, I'd like to visit.
Yep.
I mean, the big distilleries are all pretty much the same these days. The tours are pretty much the same. But at those small distilleries, you can still get a flair, a view of how things really work.
And I was thinking also of Japanese distilleries, which you haven't been able to visit.
Yeah, I've not been to Japan yet. I would like to visit several of the Japanese distilleries. Yamazaki and Chita and Hakushu especially.
Yeah.
But I would like to visit more of the distilleries in New Zealand and Australia.
Which they're taking off. I mean,
they're taking off since the last time I was down there.
I think seeing it, especially as the places that you mentioned, they're in different parts of the world with different idiosyncrasies and culture. That just seeing how they go about the business is one of those things that it's priceless to see how they go about producing whiskey. There are some of the basics that are going to be common, but is there anything that you would like the listeners in the community to know that you'd like to share that you haven't shared before?
I don't share it often enough, but I am grateful for every one of our listeners. You allow me to have the greatest job in the world because I'm having so much fun doing WhiskyCast that I can't imagine doing anything else.
And from the listener side, we want to thank you for what you do, and we really appreciate it. And
thank you.
I can tell you that I will continue to support you as long as you do WhiskyCast. You'll have my support, and I know that others probably feel the same way.
Thank you, my friend.
And you're welcome, and thank you for doing this with me.
Thanks to Juan Cruz and all of the WhiskyCast community app users who sent along questions for Juan to ask. Juan and I made a huge dent in the backlog of whiskeys on my tasting table this week, so let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the Peerless Small Batch Bourbon. It's bottled at 54.7% ABV, and the nose has touches of caramel apples, cherry pipe tobacco, brown sugar, and a hint of molasses. The taste has oak tannins and brown sugar, along with a white pepper spiciness that comes on slowly, along with notes of caramel apples and black cherries. The finish is long and subtle with a touch of oak, and I'm scoring the Peerless Small Batch Bourbon a 93. Now let's look at a single-grain Scotch whiskey, the 27-year-old Invergordon single grain from the independent bottler Dram Group. It's bottled at 52.2% ABV, and the nose is fruity and floral with touches of bananas, coconut, dried flowers, and vanilla. The taste has notes of lemon zest, banana, coconut, honey, vanilla, and just a hint of spice. The finish is long and tart, and I'm scoring Drammore's Invergordon 27-year-old a 91. Now, Bunnahabhain's 2024 Fagio releases slipped through the cracks on my tasting table for a while, but we took care of that this week. The 14-year-old Ruby Port cask finish is bottled at 58.7% ABV, and the nose has notes of plums, red grapes, coconut, and dried fruits. The taste is thick and full-bodied with plums, raisins, Christmas cake, honey, and potpourri spices. The finish is long and jammy with lingering spices, and I'm scoring the Bunnahabhain 14-year-old Fagio 2024 release a 93. And the 23-year-old Fagio release from Bunnahabhain is called a triple sherrywood finish with Amontillado, Manzanilla, and Oloroso sherry casks. It's bottled at 53.3% ABV, and the nose has a strong sherry influence with figs, dates, plums, raisins, and dark chocolate. The taste is also sherry-influenced with hints of figs, dates, orange marmalade, honey, and vanilla, while the finish is long and dry with a hint of tobacco leaf. I'm scoring the Bunnahabhain 23-year-old Fagile 2024 release a 94. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 3,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com. Let's open up the inbox now and see what people are talking about this week in our community segment. As you might expect, the Surgeon General's advisory on alcohol use dominated the conversation this week in the WhiskyCast Community app. Peter Sprunger posted this in the app. My wife does cancer research not related to this study, and I asked her why the data does not seem to show that 0 drinks equals 0 additional risks. Her 3 points were that self-reported behaviors are fraught with uncertainty and that they are reporting an average number of drinks. Someone who only drinks every 2 months but binge drinks 7 drinks in that one night may well be adding additional stress. The final point is that public health studies are very difficult to isolate certain behaviors. Canuck Sloth added this from Canada. Cancer is only one of the many risks to drinking. The Canadian study that came out a few years ago can be summarized with the following. Alcohol is a poison. It is not healthy. Do not drink because you think it has benefits to your physical health. If you drink, understand that it is no different than any other type of substance that is not healthy for you. In moderation, the risks are low. The more you drink, the more risks you have of liver damage, heart issues, obesity, etc. Each person will have a different level of risk, so make the decisions based on your personal situation. And Butler B. chimed in, tongue-in-cheek, will they slap the same warning on a quarter-pounder with cheese? Thanks to everyone who shared their last dram of 2024 and their first dram of 2025 with us this week. Just a couple of examples. First, from Alan Chanel. After consideration, I think some Harmony will be a good way to close out 2024. Some Hibiki Japanese Harmony is my last dram. Looks like it will also close out the bottle. And from Herman Mihalich at Dad's Hat Rye on his New Year's Eve dram, going with the Hiroc from Isle of Harris Distillery tonight. Who knows about tomorrow? If you'd still like to share your first dram of 2025 with us, download the free WhiskyCast Community app from your app store and join the conversation. You can also find us on X, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. For the record, my last dram of 2024 was the Balblair 1990 bottled in 2015, and the first dram of 2025 was the Glenrothes 1985 vintage I shared with Juan Cruz during our conversation for WhiskyCast In-Depth. After I shared that one on X, Bunkai H tweeted this. Good way to start the year, Mark. Are you familiar with the Canadian TV series Corner Gas? Brett buys a 20-year-old whiskey and doesn't open it for 20 years, thinking he has a 40-year-old Scotch. That said, I have old unopened whiskeys from 15 years that are different from today's same age. Well, unlike wine, whiskey does not age in the bottle, and for that reason, whiskey makers will often take an older whiskey out of its barrel and put it into glass or a plastic tote to stop the maturation process before a whiskey becomes too oaky or falls below strength. With wine, the chemical reactions and fermentation don't stop when a wine is bottled, which is why some people hold on to their wines for years before drinking them. With whiskey, the distillation process stops those chemical reactions, and the only reactions that take place after that are those where the whiskey interacts with wood and air inside the barrel. That's why a 20-year-old whiskey will always be a 20-year-old whiskey, regardless of how long it spends in a bottle. There is one way a whiskey can change inside the bottle, and it's not good. If the cork or screw cap is leaky and allows fresh air to get inside the bottle, it can cause the whiskey inside to oxidize and go bad over time. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at WhiskyCast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on X, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the WhiskyCast Community app. Download it today from your app store. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Dewar's Double Double 38-year-old blended malt has arrived, and it's a true gem for collectors. Secure a bottle, and you'll be adding a rare piece of history to your collection.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2025, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.